This is Trade Winds, final mix, mono.
I spent half my life writing and broadcasting about wine, so perhaps it's not surprising that Hennessy's, the French cognac house, knew where to find me. They invited me to be their guest as a passenger on board this magnificent sailing ship. They'd chartered her to make a special voyage from Europe to China, and they'd even renamed her the Spirit of Hennessy for the occasion. The purpose of the voyage was to commemorate the 120th anniversary of an important event in the company's history. That was its very first export of XO cognac to China in 1872. China and the East were to become one of their biggest markets. I couldn't wait to pack my duffel bag. I can't resist a sail under any circumstances. But the idea of those Far Eastern waters in a superb schooner and going ashore in exotic ports was like a dream. Above all, I'd be able to explore at first hand a subject that's always fascinated me, the centuries-long story of trade between Europe and the Far East. So let's look at the geography of it all. Here's Europe, then here's the vast mass of Central Asia, and over here, half a world away, the cities and ports of the Far East. For the earliest travellers, there was no way except to walk, and I'm afraid very few of them ever managed to walk back again. That was until the Portuguese opened up the great sea route round the southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, across the Indian Ocean, and that immense voyage remained the only way to the east until 1869, the middle of the last century, when the Suez Canal was opened. From that time on, there was a shortcut into the Indian Ocean. It halved the length of the journey. The Spirit of Hennessy took the short route, so through Egypt, across the Indian Ocean, and our voyage of discovery begins off the western coast of Malaysia. Trade between East and West really started with Marco Polo, the Venetian who journeyed to Peking in the late 13th century. His descriptions of the Orient inspired traders for generations. But it wasn't until almost 300 years later that the seaborne trade got underway. And then the European sea powers vied with each other to establish trading settlements and colonies throughout Asia. This was one of them that we're approaching now. But what I find quite remarkable is that the actual colonizers were just trading companies, private enterprise, albeit with monopolies granted by charter from their respective sovereigns. So why did they come here? Well, simply because Europeans would pay highly for silks, spices, porcelain, tea. And our first port of call on an offshore island was a vital one on voyages that could take them a year or more to complete. The free port of Penang, where every long-distance freighter would automatically stop for supplies and water. The French came through on their way to Indochina, the Dutch going to Java, the British to Hong Kong, everyone going to Shanghai or on to Japan. So it became known as the Pearl of the Orient or the Warehouse of the East. You can imagine all the names they gave it. And it was a familiar port to anyone who was going east or coming back. Where is everybody? I thought this was going to be one of those great melting pots of the nations, kaleidoscopes of the races, thronged with people. Just a few old fishing boats. But then this is Georgetown. This is the old Penang on the island. And it's really over there that all the action happens today on the mainland. The container ships stacked up by what I believe is the third longest bridge in the world. Today, the island has turned itself mainly into a holiday resort, and a trishaw is the perfect way for a visitor to have a good look round. The architecture certainly reveals the Western influence that's been brought to bear on the place. There's the British colonial style, looking particularly decorative under an equatorial sky. And then there's the more mundane modern Western style, very unexciting in contrast, and something that can be found virtually anywhere in the world. And there are some beautiful reminders that religions also make their mark on the way a place looks. This mosque, for example, which was built in 1800, has an Indian flavour. And of course, there are Buddhist temples too. Now, as a writer on such matters, I'm always curious to find out what people drink in different countries. So you're a Muslim, you don't drink then?
No, it's no problem. No, all Muslims never drink. Some of them drink.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
What, beer or what?
Beer, anything, toddy also.
Toddy also?
Yeah.
They tell me toddy's not very good.
It's not for every day.
You think I should try it?
Yeah, you can try, so it's no problem.
Where could I do that?
No, I can send you there.
Really?
Yeah.
Ah, okay, well, let's go. Let's try some toddy. Hi. Hello.
Yeah.
This is the famous toddy, isn't it?
Yeah, it's coconut water.
Coconut water?
Yeah.
How old is this?
$1. No, this one is...
1 day?
Yeah, 1 day.
1 day?
12 hours. இதெல்லாம் பேசாதீங்க அந்த சவுண்ட் அங்க வந்துரும்
Never tasted anything like that before.
No.
It's different taste.
No, this one is very original toddy.
Very lovely.
Each day take the
Is that
toddy.
fermenting?
Yeah, 1 day once.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so that is 1 day old.
Yeah, 1 day, 8 to 8. 8 morning, 8 night.
So
12 hours.
In an hour that's finished.
Yeah, 12 hours. Until 12 hours.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, I think I tasted it at just the right age.
Yeah.
That's perfect. Thank you very much. Thanks. And it's a delight to come across a street stall that isn't selling burgers or hot dogs. Attracted by the aroma wafting around as we passed by, I couldn't resist stopping. Stalls like this, selling traditional food, are very much a part of the scene in Penang. And wonderfly appetizing it is too, although a bit difficult to eat elegantly. Penang was the first British settlement in Malaya. It was acquired by the British East India Company in 1786 in order to counter the growing threat of French domination in the area. Captain Francis Light, who was in charge of the proceedings, decided to build a fort here. Hey, would you take a picture of me? But to get the jungle cleared to make room for the fort, Francis Light came up with an ingenious idea. He loaded up a cannon with silver coins and fired it into the trees. The local population then proceeded to chop down all the trees to make sure they found every last coin. Expensive, but effective. It seemed only fair to take my turn. But thinking about it, it's a bit undignified for someone staying in a hotel with a facade as grand as this, the E&O, the Eastern and Oriental Hotel. The curious duplication in the title was the result of, you guessed it, a merger. Dawn. And I couldn't help waking early in eager anticipation of the next leg of our voyage. But things can go wrong on ships, and here we are in the most pirated waters in the world. I suppose a seafarer 100 years ago must have had rather similar thoughts to these. Certainly one thing that hasn't changed is that the sea remains the primal force. And here we are, challenging it with our fragile ship in the name of that other great imperative, trade. It was the trade winds that were the driving force behind the steady growth in commerce between East and West. But why the term trade winds? Well, around the equator, the prevailing winds are very constant, both in direction and speed, so they could always be relied on by the merchant ships. Because the rewards were potentially so huge, piracy was always widespread, and the fact that it still is confirmed by the skipper, Anders Nilsson. What about all the stories of pirates? Do you think they're all things of the past?
Oh, no. We actually know that there is quite a lot of pirates left, and we do believe they are going to be a threat to us. And we don't exactly know what we're going to do about it, but we know that we are something coming for us. Oh, aye.
Really?
Oh, aye, that's...
You mean we need an escort?
If we could get one, we would appreciate it. I don't know if we could get one, but one other thing is you could try not to be under sail during night time, because that's when the problem starts. Daytime, at least we think it's okay during daytime.
But how do they turn up, these pirates?
So they come in very fast motorboats, you see.
Really?
Oh, aye, they would overtake us in a jiffy. There's no way we could outsail them, no way.
And it happens quite often?
It does, yes. And even big super tankers are attacked by them.
Really?
Oh, aye, so a small sailing vessel would be nothing for them.
Well, we're less interesting than a super tanker, maybe.
Yeah, in one way, yeah.
We're now sailing south into the Straits of Malacca and onto our next port of call, which gave its name to the straits. This was the shortest route from the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea, and because it also commanded the seaways to the Spice Islands, the port of Malacca, originally a medieval walled town, was at one time the centre of trade for the whole of Asia. As it was such a prize, it was constantly fought over, and so it belonged successively to the Portuguese, the Dutch and the British, and they all left traces of their ownership. This 18th century church, painted blood red, was built by the Dutch. I'm not actually sure I like it. In another church built by the Portuguese, you can see reminders of a way of life that was far from tranquil. And in amongst the headstones you can even find symbols of pirates. No doubt these were the respectable ones, the local pillars of society. Malacca still strongly evokes its maritime, mercantile past. History-hungry tourists and collectors come here to enjoy browsing amongst the museums, churches and antique shops. But how I'd love to have seen it in the 16th century when one Portuguese sailor wrote, "Malacca is the richest seaport with the greatest number of merchants and abundance of shipping that can be found in the whole world." It's something like 150 miles from Malacca to Singapore. That's a couple of days sailing. But that won't be a hardship. This schooner was built in 1990 specifically for cruising, and she's just like a five-star hotel. Even though she's only about half the size of the old clippers, 44 meters in length and just over 7 meters across, there's still plenty of space. In an old clipper, though, you couldn't have moved. She'd have been packed with cargo and crawling with crew. And not surprisingly, she has all the latest navigational aids. But to keep the record straight, it has to be said that the basic one, the compass, originated in China back in the mists of time, and that's helped Western mariners stay on course for centuries. Modern charts are pinpoint accurate, but the early navigators had nothing to go by except memory. And even this beautiful 17th century Italian map is not much more than an artist's impression. We're now entering the really busy shipping lanes, and I think I might be becoming paranoid. I keep having visions of pirates raising the Jolly Roger and darting in for the attack. The further we go, the more ships we're surrounded by. And eventually the sight of hundreds of them, laid out in rows from horizon to horizon, is quite awe-inspiring. But I suppose it shouldn't be surprising, as Singapore is now the world's busiest port, handling over 40,000 ships a year. And as well as being one of the most important manufacturing centres of Asia, it has the third largest oil refining complex in the world. Travellers arriving by air get an even more spectacular view. The volume of trade that's carried on here today is an enduring legacy of the British East India Company. And this powerful skyline wouldn't be here now if it hadn't been for one of its far-sighted administrators. He was Thomas Stamford Raffles. Contemporary descriptions of him reveal that he was a courteous and pleasant man. One says very tellingly that he spoke in smiles. In 1819, searching for a site for a new harbour, he explored this river mouth and decided that it would be ideal, safe anchorage even for the huge 1,000-ton East Indiamen, as they were called, the largest ships around. And it was to be a free port, which is always good for traders since no customs duties are payable on the movement of goods within it. Singapore grew rapidly, and Raffles himself actually planned the layout of the settlement. It became a vibrant, popular, and profitable place to do business in. Even social life was rewarding for the ever-increasing number of British who came to settle here. By 1824, the population had risen to 11,000. By the beginning of the present century, it was 250,000. Raffles ended up as Sir Stamford Raffles, but the famous Raffles Hotel keeps the name of the city's founder on people's lips today. Opened in 1886, it's seen many a famous face. And at least in one sense, I can say I'm following in the footsteps of great writers such as Somerset Maugham, Rudyard Kipling, and Joseph Conrad. Singapore today is a very modern city. In fact, everywhere you look, you see the signs of progress. If you look up, you find a new 70-story hotel. If you go down, underground, you find the MRT, the Mass Rapid Transit System, serving the present-day population of 2.75 million. Most of the people are of Chinese descent, but it's a strikingly multi-ethnic city. One strong association with the days of the British Empire remains, a field called the Padang, where against a backdrop of skyscrapers, cricket is still played regularly. But if it's unusual sights you're after, just look at this. Singapore is suffering in the same way as every other world-class city at ground level. But I'm glad to say that steps have now been taken to preserve and even restore some of what's disappeared of old Singapore. Its Chinatown is just as lively and full of colour as Chinatown anywhere. Our next port of call, Hong Kong, some 1,500 miles away. It's so peaceful and idyllic under sail, out on the high seas, as the sun begins to set, that it's difficult to remind oneself that it was a hard and dangerous way of life for the old sea traders. But it was very profitable. A ship with a hold full of spices, destined to rescue boring European food, could expect to make up to 10 times what it had cost to make the voyage. And that included the value of the ship. As payment, the Europeans could offer cloth, manufactured goods, and silver bullion. In due course, Western luxuries began to go east, and XO Cognac is a marvellous example of that. It was the British East India Company that was to become the most powerful trading and colonising force of all. It became directly or indirectly responsible for a fifth of the human race. It had a navy and a standing army that was greater than that of any single European nation. This, remember, was just a trading company. It was private enterprise on a scale that hasn't been equalled before or since. It was another company, though, which was to dominate trade with China. Hong Kong was the base for Jardine Matheson, who were so successful they came to be known as the Princely Hong. Although there's hardly a more sparkling, forward-looking place on earth, I have to admit that I see ghosts of Hong Kong past lurking round every corner. It's not a very long past either. The reason that it exists at all goes back, inevitably, to the British East India Company. Eager to buy Chinese goods, but not so happy about parting with so much silver, the company decided to exploit the Chinese taste for opium. It was grown in abundance in Bengal, a territory already under their control. So even though the Chinese emperor had forbidden its import, it became the main currency to pay for Chinese goods. Finally, the emperor's representative in Canton seized and burnt 20,000 chests of opium. This triggered the First Opium War, which the British won. It ended in 1842 with a treaty giving Hong Kong to Britain. A contemporary called Hong Kong a notch cut in China as a woodsman notches a tree, to mark it for felling at a convenient opportunity. That was the way the British thought. Even China was within their grasp. This is wonderful. The Peninsula Hotel. It may only have been built in 1928, but it's something a lot of tourists are keen to see. And I can assure you that if you've travelled halfway around the world, the superb decor gives you the feeling that you've arrived somewhere worth arriving at. Well, talking of travel, I've decided on style and comfort today, but it does make me think for a moment about how people needed determination and a strong constitution to get here at all. Look at air travel. It used to take 9 days to get here from Europe, in those wonderful seaplanes. They had a sense of adventure about them, although I think these poor passengers have rather lost theirs. Eventually a runway was built out into the harbour, and so a journey that had started out as a 6 or 7 month voyage has now become a mere 13-hour flight. And communications have changed beyond all recognition.
It's you. What about, say, midday? Will you be there? Great. Okay, see you. Thanks.
There's no doubt everything's a lot more convenient these days, and that's good for business, which is, after all, the bottom line here.
Only 15 years ago, this was the El Cheapo capital of the East. Its business was all plastic dolls and the things you find in cornflakes packets, that kind of thing. Now, it's one of the most expensive cities in the world. It's not the workshops that make it buzz, it's the stock exchange. It's all these fantastic property developments you see everywhere. And what's made the difference? It's because Hong Kong today is once again seen as the gateway to China and all that that promises for the future, which of course was the way that it was intended in the first place. A limo is all very well, but anyone who really knows Hong Kong knows that there is one grandstand view, and that's the Star Ferry. Crossing on the harbour on the Star Ferry, you just get a sight like nothing else in the world. Nestling below the peak are all these extraordinary towering buildings. The Bank of China, the Hong Kong-Shanghai Bank, Jardine House. Over there, a building that apparently is going to be the tallest in Asia and the 4th tallest in the world, just growing up to its full height. There is nothing like this.
The funicular railway, though, has also been offering views of Hong Kong for more than 100 years.
The Peak Cable Tram travels to the top station, 1,300 feet above the sea, in 7 minutes. And inhabitants of the colony call this gliding climb a shortcut to fairyland.
But the view from above has changed dramatically since that was filmed. A fair amount of effort has been put into reclaiming land from the sea, especially in the 1950s and 60s, to create more living and working space. And expansion hasn't just been horizontal. Building upwards has been equally essential to accommodate the needs of what's now grown to a figure of almost 6 million people. So what looked like this a few decades ago has now undergone a spectacular metamorphosis. It's all quite stunning. And to quote a local witticism, Hong Kong will be a wonderful place, if they ever get it finished. One controversial construction is the shining glass and metal Bank of China building, completed a lifetime ago, in 1989. Well, the old Bank of China building now houses the China Club, which is where I'm due to meet one of Hong Kong's captains of industry. No one knows what it'll really be like after 1997, when the colony is handed over to China, and there are many doubts about the long-term political outcome. But in the meanwhile, according to Simon Murray, day-to-day commercial life goes on apace.
If you want to have a really visible example of what's happening between Hong Kong and China, the best place is to go and stand at the border for half an hour and watch the trucks coming across. There are about 17,000, 18,000 trucks a day coming across the border, carrying these huge, great containers, these boxes, and bringing them down to the Paichung container terminal. We, in fact, operate half of the number of boxes that go through the container terminal, and at peak hours, we have 400 trucks. It's an hour coming through our container terminal. That's one truck every 9 seconds.
My God. So you're really positive about the future of the trade with China? I mean,
well, an American once said, I think at the beginning of the last century, that when goods don't cross frontiers, armies will. And the reverse of that is true. If you're trading like mad with a country, I think that's very healthy and very positive.
And what's in all these containers then? I mean, in the old days it used to be silk, Chinaware, tea and things like that, but what are we now importing from China?
Well, Hong Kong is trading with China to the tune of about 50 billion US dollars a year. And much of China's foreign investment is coming from Hong Kong. And it is the movement of factories from Hong Kong into China. Hong Kong has no natural resources, nothing. We don't even have enough water to drink. China has land, cheap labor, and natural resources. So our factories are moving up to China. And what you're seeing coming back is the sort of things that you would expect to be exported from Hong Kong. So you've got consumer electronics, textiles, garments, toys, computer components, and so on, that sort of thing, watches.
And in the other direction, what does China want to import from the West?
Well, China's priority today is industrial plant and machinery and so on, the sort of things that it will help it to manufacture these things that we're going to buy from them. China is essentially going to be a labor-intensive market for a long time. And so if you think in terms of labor-intensive goods, those are the kind of products that are going to emerge from China in the short term.
But is there, do you think, in China room for any of the luxury goods? I mean, I'm thinking of wines and spirits. What about them?
Well, the Chinese are no different to anybody else as they continue to export, and the growth of this southern part of China, growing at about 30% per annum and more. That means more money in the pockets of the individuals. And as you have more money in the pockets, so they want better life, better standards, exactly the same as everybody else. So their taste in cognac, for example, is improving all the time. I remember when I first came to Hong Kong 26 years ago, everybody drank 3-star brandy. Today, people don't even look at 3-star brandy. Totally unacceptable. It's XO or nothing.
It's sad, isn't it, that the tea dance has now become virtually a footnote in the pages of social history. But I've come to a tea house. These are traditionally popular meeting places in Hong Kong, to have a cup of tea with Mr. Ho. He's been selling XO in Hong Kong for most of his life, and he's a veritable exophile, pointing out that the letter X in the name symbolizes strength and virility to the Chinese, and that it's done him a world of good over the years. I can't understand a word, of course.
He has been selling cognac for 60 years, and he drinks a little bit of cognac every day, and he believes that it's good for health and it stimulates blood circulation.
I suppose tea was hardly the right drink after all that. The bright lights are very alluring, but I've decided to go back to the ship and join Gilles Hennessy at the captain's table, where the conversation has again naturally turned to cognac.
You know, cognac has always traveled very well. It's been around now for about 150 years in Asia, and Asia has always been one of cognac's greatest markets. And as you know as an expert anyway, distilled spirits like cognac basically don't change in a bottle. Unlike wine that can evolve, cognac shouldn't change. Amazing.
Here we are, let's take.
Let's see.
Bravo. Okay. Yes, I think I recognize that.
You do? Yeah. Bye.
We're now on our way to our final port of call, Shanghai. Maybe one day someone will explain to me why it is that Oriental merchants didn't sail with their goods to Europe, once they knew what a market there was there. I find that quite puzzling, especially since one enterprising junk called the Qi Ying did actually make it to London via New York in 1846. Anyway, from about 1700, the trade with China was almost all focused on tea, and the old East Indiaman carried back vast amounts to a very thirsty Europe. But our ship is reminiscent of the later square-rigged clippers, which were designed for speed rather than volume of cargo. By the middle of the 19th century, they were clipping something like 20 days off the time previously required, reducing the passage from Europe to China to about 90 days. Clippers even raced each other. Every year, the first cargo to reach the dealers would fetch the highest price. Speed had become an increasingly important factor as steamships were starting to be a viable alternative. And inevitably, in the end, sail had to give way to steam. And so we find ourselves in the muddy Wangpo River, looking at some very speedy cargo boats. Dangerously so, I'd have said. The Wangpo, which is a tributary of the Yangtze, is the entrance to Shanghai, and that's a name to conjure with. The verb to Shanghai means drugging a sailor and abducting him while he's unconscious. Not many places have a claim to fame like that. And it's certainly a name that hints at a past full of mystery and intrigue.
I've been imagining, talking, even dreaming about Shanghai for weeks now, with only really a pretty sketchy idea of what to expect. Certainly no shortage of people, weather a bit mixed. A sort of Chinese Naples or Liverpool was what I really thought I'd find, and first impressions are not so very different.
In the same 1842 treaty that ceded Hong Kong to Britain, the Chinese agreed to open up 5 of their ports to the world, and Shanghai was one of these. But just over a century later, the foreign account was closed by the Communist Party, and it's only in the last few years that international trading has been revived. There's plenty of life, colour and atmosphere behind the waterfront, where alongside the Chinese, the British, the Americans and the French used to run their own districts, which had been ceded to them. And some of their influence still remains. One could easily imagine, for example, that this was a suburb of Paris. And here's an oddity. The main liquor merchants in the city used to be housed in a mock English Tudor building, half timbering and all. I certainly didn't expect to see anything like this. Having premises on the Bund was a matter of prestige, the architecture being of the rather sober kind. Now, though, they're building a new Shanghai, one that's designed to be attractive to today's businessman. The transformation of Shanghai into what they call a modern cosmopolis is so important to the Chinese that this area, Pudong, on the opposite side of the river to the Bund, is proclaimed as the main project of the whole country's development plan. 12 million people live in Shanghai, yet its public services, roads and so on, are designed to cope with barely a half of that number. So one can foresee that with major shipping companies and traders negotiating to return, there's going to be some chaotic years ahead. The greatest surprise to me is how electrifying the place is already. I just didn't expect to see a glittering go-ahead city of this sort. It comes as a revelation. And then there's another surprise. Jazz is still alive and well in Shanghai. Despite all the changes of the last 40 years or so in the culture of communist China, the music that virtually epitomizes the Western approach to life carries on in the Peace Hotel on the Bund. This is what the visitor is really looking for, though, the image of old China. This is the Yu Garden, originally created during the Ming Dynasty, 400 years ago. This was all meticulously designed and landscaped as a three-dimensional work of art, in which the owner could seek and find peace and solace, and a chance to contemplate. It's said that its zigzag bridge and pagodas inspired the famous willow pattern design, now to be found on plates and dishes, on sideboards and dressers throughout the Western world. You may even recognize this tea house. You get the best out of Chinese cuisine, because of its nature, if you eat in company. The variety of dishes is much greater, so it's nice to join a group, as I've been invited to do here. But what surprises me is that there seems to be very little lingering over a meal. And of course, strangest of all to me with my background, there's no tradition of drinking wine with a meal. Wine is actually produced in China, but it's beer or a soft drink that mainly serves as the accompaniment. Or indeed what's considered to be the best of all, cognac. Often, as here, served alongside another drink. It's not kept back until after the meal, you drink it all the way through. And of course it's not just taken with meals. And so with China, and indeed Asia in general, now constituting an enormous market for cognac, one can understand why that first shipment of XO was so important to Hennessy's back in 1872. And this is the culmination of our voyage, the reenactment of the delivery of that very first precious cargo, which was to transform a nation's taste in drink. The trade winds truly are the winds of change. By the start of this century, Shanghai was a highly industrialized, commercialized, and internationalized entity. The British, Americans, and French were joined by the Japanese, the Russians, the Jews, the old cliché melting pot, attached itself to Shanghai more than anywhere in China, although conflict and communism cooled the contents before the century was halfway through. And now the pot is beginning to bubble once again.
Well, what a time to arrive in Shanghai. If the auguries are right, the 1990s are going to be rather like the start of this century here, and even more so. What are the symptoms of a boom town? Buildings going up everywhere, hotels and shops packed out, too many people, the infrastructure overstretched to bursting, and a certain feeling in the air. Whether capitalism and communism can work together, the future will decide. And the future will decide whether the old Bund is rebuilt as a classic facade or whether something else happens to it. But one thing's certain, behind that facade, Shanghai is frantically rebuilding itself. A race is going on between the Chinese themselves, America, Europe and Japan to put up buildings for the 21st century. And this time, they're not the great granite erections of classical times. They are buildings for China and the Chinese. Ever since Marco Polo's time, people have become very excited in discovering China. Am I being just one of these excited new arrivals, all starry-eyed with the promise of a people, a culture, a market, bigger and with a more exciting potential than any other on Earth? I don't think so.